Here's to re-recording a video because I ran out of space and the original file corrupted when I was like 2 minutes away from finishing the script. Yippee! Welcome to Movie Magic. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and last week you might recall that I briefly reviewed the OG Indiana Jones trilogy and discussed how I believe that those movies all hold up. I didn't love the second movie as much as the other two, but the others were just as good as I remembered, or even better, on rewatches, so I had a hearty old time with all three films. This week, I will talk about the films that came out decades later, and you will see as this goes on why I retroactively kind of hate myself for deciding to split the first three movies and the last two. Even though it still makes sense, I still question the decision just a little bit. Anyway, more on the topic at hand. I love the original Indy films overall. I also love The Great Circle, which came out in late 2024 and I played in early 2025, which sits pretty nicely in the chronology established by a couple of those early movies. But I was not just happy to watch the original films, oh no, I wanted to watch the legacy sequels too. Why? Well, because I love Indy and I thought it would be fun, and also to see if they are actually as bad as people say. In one case, yes. In the other case, no. And lest I say more here, let's actually review the movies. And be warned, whereas last week's video contained very minor spoilers for the OG trilogy, this video will contain pretty massive spoilers for either one or both of these movies, depending on how in the weeds I get. Just so you know. On to the reviews. I very well know the reputation of Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I'm pretty sure we all do. It was the black sheep, the ugly duckling, the red-headed stepchild, the odd one out of the Indiana Jones franchise. So much so that it sees the lowest average of the 5 films on Letterboxd. Somehow. We'll discuss this particular point a little bit later, but needless to say, I disagree with the general sentiment of this film. I quite liked Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. A lot. Actually, it's one of those films where I actually do understand to one degree or another basically all the gripes other people might have with it. One in particular really stands out in this regard, but those gripes don't bother me much at all, or at least not enough to make a big bugaboo about them over the merits I think the film has. To start, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is still a Spielberg film. This actually does a lot for retaining the spirit of the franchise. After all, with the extra 2 decades under his belt, this is Spielberg effectively at the top of his game. My collection of the Indy films I own has a ton of special features, and most of those, the vast majority, are specific to this film. And man, watching the making of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull reminded me of a time when I myself really wanted to pursue filmmaking. Watching a master director at work, not to mention all the other facets that make a good movie, I just had a stark joy that I felt with this experience. A joy which I felt during not just the film itself, but also during the behind-the-scenes content as well. Because that's just it, right? This 4th Indiana Jones film is a very competent film. The direction, the cinematography, the blocking and framing, the choreography, the editing, the heart and soul of Indiana Jones. Everything that I want from one of these movies is here. Well, basically everything. I'm not going to tell you that Crystal Skull is infallible, because it isn't. The final act is pretty messy. Irina's comeuppance is somewhat underwhelming on account of a truly silly and frankly dumb climax. And the climax is, as said, pretty dumb, and at least silly. I was not at all against the alien idea in general, because the movie still tries to use the legends and mistaken mythos of the times in interesting ways, but I have to admit that the crystal skeletons in the final moments combining together and forming a literal interdimensional alien was pretty stupid. It was. Immediately after finishing the movie, the silliness of this finale kinda took me out overall a bit, and so in that way I sort of understand the broadly unfavorable sentiment, but the more time that passes, the more that I love this movie, and the more of the special features and making of material for it I watched, the more I was just smitten by the background of this film. That's not even because the construction of Crystal Skull is like that special or that spectacular, but something about the entire experience just really sits right with me. Another bonus point for Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is the fact that Spielberg and so many other Indiana Jones crew staples are involved. Even if you don't like some of the decisions made, the filmmaking is genuinely good. The chase sequences in Marshall College and the jungle are great without being overlong, very Indiana Jones in that way, and something that the next movie, spoiler alert, does not get right. The character writing and handling of the conceit via relative historicity, setting, etc. is true to the tone and spirit of the franchise. The choreography of every fight is splendid, especially the sword duel between Mutt and Irina. My God, it was just so good. The humor is also rightly intact. Even the special effects and CGI is right in that era where they served to the benefit of the film and never took me out. Advanced enough for the 2000s to look good in spite of subtle aging, without being so technically good that they start to look bad again like we see more in the past several years. Most everything about the construction of this film, pre-production to post-production, simply does something to me, man. I get why some have reservations about this movie, but 2.8 out of 5 on Letterboxd? Are you kidding me? This movie is not that bad, not in a million years. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, on the other hand, now that's another matter entirely. This movie sucks. Just straight up. There's hardly anything that I enjoyed about it. The little mini rant review that I posted to some of my friends on Discord immediately after watching this movie mostly sufficed in expressing my broader thoughts on the movie, so I'll actually be using that, albeit with plenty of additional expansions and clarifications, to produce the bulk of the remainder of this review. Most of the following comes from that rant I wrote right after the movie finished. And it started with, God, that was awful, truly and objectively bad. The first two problems I can name that afflict the film broad scale are as follows. 1. The Dial of Destiny can't decide if it's set in the 21st century or the middle-late 20th as a result of mediocre design, visual incoherence, and a lack of attention to detail with regard to the time period. Nominally set in the middle of the US's involvement with the Vietnam War, the film does literally nothing with this anywhere except for set dressing. The rest of the time, it feels equally plausible to be in the 80s, as the 90s, as the 2000s, as the 2020s, depending on the moment, refusing to settle into anything that makes sense. 2. The Dial of Destiny can't decide if it's Indiana Jones or if it's Mission Impossible, and so succeeds at being neither due to the conflict of stylistic interest. Chase scenes and similar action set pieces have always been a part of the Indiana Jones DNA, to be sure, but every one of these types of sequences in the Dial of Destiny feel like subpar apings of Mission Impossible sequences, and not even necessarily the best ones. I think especially of the Rome car chase in Dead Reckoning, which goes on at least a few minutes longer than it really needed to, though I didn't properly hate that sequence because it still wound up being amusing, if overlong. In the case of the final Indiana Jones flick, every action sequence is multiple minutes too long, and half of them serve effectively no purpose. It forgets that Indiana Jones is not an action franchise. It is an action-adventure franchise, and the movie serves up no real adventure somehow. There are moments where it's trying to, sort of, but it never works out. Now for the remaining failures of the film, which are many. 3. There are historical inaccuracies, and borderline anachronisms abound throughout the film as a result of it not nailing down its own setting very well, if at all, and that kept me solidly out of touch with whatever tone it may have been trying to achieve, although I can't properly tell if there was a desired tone in the first place. 4. The stakes of the film are non-existent, and so this movie, which is 2.5 hours for some reason, even though all 4 of the others are only 2 hours, is inconceivably boring after the prologue is done. A large part of the boredom is actually, ironically, because the Dial of Destiny just completely fumbles any attempt at carrying the storyline and conceit as set up by the prologue forward. 5, and there will be multiple subpoints to this, the writing sucks on multiple fronts, such as dialogue lacking any punch, except when delivering pretty firmly modern sentiments in pretty modern ways. One example of the terrible writing on hand in this movie: Indiana Jones says, "It's not yours, you stole it." And then the villain says, "And then you stole it." And then his goddaughter says, "And then I stole it. It's called capitalism." This is one of the stupidest and worst performed lines I've ever heard, and easily the worst in an Indiana Jones film, and it's broadly indicative of the writer's intentions here. You can tell this was written by people who think they are far more clever than they actually are, quote-unquote modernizing a franchise that did not need to be modernized, and even if you agree with the sentiment, which I don't, nobody talks like this. They just don't. Another general critique of the writing is in the character writing specifically. The Dial of Destiny effectively assassinates the coolness of Indy's character, undoes and ruins the, in my opinion, great closing arcs that Crystal Skull gave us, and does so immediately after the prologue ends, and fails at attempts both to appease an audience in regard to certain past characters, and in the fan service it tries to offset it with. The incoherence of these decisions lead to an utter failure at both the excitement that I should have had, seeing like Marion at the end for an example, because she should have been here the entire time, quite frankly, and with the attempted emotional moments that we're supposed to sympathize with Indy about, namely Mutt's death, which occurs off-screen in Nom just because people didn't like Mutt in Crystal Skull, I guess, and the subsequent divorce between Indy and Marion that sees Marion not participate in 95% of the movie, and which is, for some reason, healed in the end. Because reasons. Everything just felt so disingenuous, like the Dial of Destiny is ashamed of its predecessor. And I guess, to be fair, if you asked anybody who watched Crystal Skull, most people might have had a problem with it being a sequel to Crystal Skull, but it definitely would have made Dial of Destiny way better if it was. It at least would have been respecting the characters and the writing of the previous film. If this had instead been another adventure of Indy and Mutt and Marion instead serving as a sequel to Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, you would have at least had those characters that I cared about. Which brings me to a third critique of the writing. Aside from just mishandling the existing characters, not a single one of the new characters in this movie is at all interesting. At all. I don't even remember any of their names because I simply could not have cared less. Just know I had to whip out Google just to write the rest of this paragraph. Elena managed to be intriguing for all but 5 seconds at the start until she decided to just be a stupid, greedy asshat, which itself reminded me that I also hated how the film introduced Indy as a loser following the prologue for some unfathomable reason. Dr. Voller is an incredibly disinteresting villain to the point that 3 days after viewing this film, I couldn't even remember who the villain of the movie even was. Mads Mikkelsen does his best, but there's just nothing to care about here. And besides, following that absolute crunch to the skull that man took in the prologue, he should have at least looked like he took that hit. But alas, he does not. The other villains are so unimportant that I'm pretty sure they don't actually have names, no matter what Letterboxd is telling me different. Boyd Holbrook? Olivia Richters? Who? I don't know. Teddy is also just a 21st century kid through, and no amount of anything can convince me otherwise. He's 50% of the reason why I cannot watch this movie and conceivably be convinced it takes place in 1969. And any other characters are all but ancillary. Oh, except for the one other interesting character besides Indy, who was good in the prologue, but he doesn't exist in the rest of the movie for no other reason than to prop up Helena's existence, but Helena sucks, so who the hell cares? Not me, that's who. But anyhow, you get the picture. The writing in this film, it's awful. In the end, the Dial of Destiny triples down on the fact that it is an intrinsically flawed and defective version of an already incredibly flawed and defective script. The only notably good part of the movie is the thing I've mentioned a million times up to this point, kind of as a counterpoint to all of the bad things: the prologue. It was a good enough opening that, despite how jarring an 80-year-old Harrison Ford's voice coming out of a digitally de-aged 40-something-year-old Indiana Jones's face, I had got my hopes up for the rest of the film as a result of the prologue. And as a side note, the de-aging of the movie is actually quite good. I will give props for that. I was never distracted by younger Indy's appearance here, except when he spoke, and he doesn't even do that much in the prologue. But though the Dial of Destiny managed to get my hopes up in the first nearly half hour, reminding me of what I like about Indiana Jones so much, the rest of the film continually and repeatedly dashed those hopes with facepalm after groan, after Jackie Chan whatthefuck.jpg meme, after, okay, I have literally nothing better to do than to play flow free while this travesty runs its course. And I'm serious, by the way. By halfway through this movie, I was playing flow free alongside watching this film because I was so bored and unenthused with what I was watching. I'm not one to walk out of theaters, but I wonder if I would have been upset enough to do that with this film. And did I even mention that this movie is straight up boring? Like, absurdly boring. I don't know if I did. If so, sorry to repeat myself. And if not, this is your confirmation the Dial of Destiny is just boring when it's not bad. And I'm not sure which of those two things is worse. In every sense of the phrase, this movie is an abject failure. It doesn't even attempt to be a good film. The cinematography never deigned to be interesting. The direction feels like it's literally not there at all, especially when compared to Steven Spielberg's direction of the previous 4 movies, which begs the question, why even bother without Spielberg at the helm at all? And the editing of the film is a travesty. It is boring in large part due to the terrible bloat that sees this movie stuffed with entirely unnecessary sequences, and the special effects, which probably swallowed a huge chunk of the budget, they're laughably bad. They're just so bad. The climax especially just looks like garbage. This series has taken great lengths to be largely practical and on location, excepting pretty much only the climax of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which is the worst part of that movie, to be clear. But this final installment of the franchise looks terrible in the climax. If the Siege of Syracuse is set on location, it does not frickin' look it, dude. Not in the slightest. In fact, I would find it quite hilarious if it was filmed practically, because that would be a pretty great testament to the poor filmmaking quality as a whole. Also, The Dial of Destiny is the only indie flick not shot on film. I think this was notable, and if Teddy is 50% of the reason this movie feels distinctly modern where it shouldn't, then the writing is 30% of the reason, and the digital cameras and shoddy special effects is probably the remaining 20%. As I closed my rant review on Discord, I am offended by this movie and what it does to everything I respect and enjoyed and loved about the previous 4 Indiana Jones films. And the recent game, for that matter, The Great Circle. I will almost certainly never watch The Dial of Destiny ever again. It was a waste of potential after a great opening sequence, resulting in a waste of my entire evening the night that I watched it. The prologue is not worth watching on its own, and the rest is not worth watching at all. I absolutely do not recommend ever watching Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Ever. And there you have it. With these 2 videos, you now have my general thoughts on all 5 Indiana Jones movies. I think nearly all of them are worth watching and thoroughly enjoyed most of them, as previously discussed. One of the legacy sequels does in fact suck, but the other does not, actually. Very obviously, I prefer Crystal Skull over whatever the newest thing was, and based on my general sentiments expressed in both this video and last week's video, and with these implicit mini rankings provided in the conclusions, you also can probably guess my overall ranking of the franchise here, but I will do more proper ranking of the movies next week, and I will include The Great Circle into that ranking as well, and pairing along with it, summaries of my spoiler-free thoughts about all of these different titles, since I include included some spoilers for these two films, for example. Chances are you won't need to watch that video, but I want to make it anyway, and for the sake of the folk who want a quick, dedicated ranking without the direct spoilery references, and also for the sake of talking about Indy a little bit unscripted, I feel overall justified in my decision. But for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.